Hey everyone, thanks for coming. My name's Craig Lindsay, if you don't know me. I'm in the doctoral program at CalU. This is a presentation on restricted housing or solitary confinement. Restricted housing has many different names and it causes many different mental health issues. There's also legal concerns and there's been changes in recent years with juveniles. So before we get started, I actually have a video to show everybody.
Here on the outside, there's a common belief that solitary confinement is only for the most hardened inmates, but not so. In some prisons, breaking basic rules or being caught with contraband will earn a prisoner time in the hole, and almost all of these men will be released back into society someday. Studies show they're actually more likely to reoffend on the outside as a result. We return now to ABC's Dan Harris, almost through his first full day of confinement, to look for clues as to why.
I've now been in solitary for 18 hours. I'm meeting with jail officials.
It feels good to be out of that little cage, I'll tell you that much.
When we are loudly interrupted.
What is that?
It is my neighbor, the mentally ill inmate, breaking down while guards return him to his cell after a court appearance. Jail officials admit sometimes when they put people in solitary, they just get worse.
So that raises the question about whether maybe is there a better way?
That's a question that we all are asking, and I don't know what the answer is.
While here at this jail, most inmates are not in solitary for more than 60 days, in some prisons, inmates can be in for years, decades even. When I'm returned to my cell after my meeting with the guards, listen to what one of them tells me.
Thank you. I appreciate it, thank you.
I'm back in my cell for the rest of this day of tedium, broken up only by barely edible meals.
A bologna sandwich, a little bit of lettuce, a couple slices of American cheese, some cookies. I know I've only got about 18 hours left, but I'm having a hard time wrapping my head around how to make it through the sheer density of the boredom that being in solitary entails.
In another part of the jail, Marcel Woods passes the time by writing his mom a letter.
I just put my mom, I told her when I have trial coming up.
Marcel has been in and out of jail and prison his entire life. This time it's theft and assault charges.
Hopefully this time I learn my lesson. This isn't the place to be.
If you don't have this, then you go stir crazy. We listen to news, music, sports.
August Rayfield, who swears by his jail-issued transistor radio, is in for meth possession, stolen checks, and domestic violence. The other thing keeping him sane, the calendar on which he counts down the days.
10, 31, 31, 31. And that's what you hear all day. That's what you hear 24/7. No way to live on it. Don't break the law.
Back in my cell, the noise has also begun. It's my neighbor downstairs again. As I get ready for sleep, I'm wondering whether I can make it. The guards have told me I can leave at any time if I can't take it anymore. That idea is becoming increasingly tempting. The next morning, I wake up in my tiny cell.
Personally, I can smell freedom at this point, and I am ready to get out of here.
Outside, Deputy AC makes his final rounds of the morning before his shift ends. He admits looking at the faces of men behind glass every day is not easy psychologically.
The night shift is intense. You gotta stay awake. You gotta stay active. Every day is a new story.
Every inmate gets 1 free hour outside his cell per day.
All right, shower time.
They told me not to interact with any of the inmates, even when they taunt me.
I have a prepaid call from an inmate in Denver Downtown Detention Center.
During my free hour, I also get a chance to call my wife.
In terms
trouble with my mentally ill neighbor. And I finally get to meet my fellow inmates and ask them, if you did the crime, shouldn't you do the time?
I don't know how much sympathy there is in the general public for people who committed crimes.
All right. I didn't know if anybody was familiar with how that worked, so I thought a video would be good to get everybody a general idea.
You and your team need to get things done. Monday.com is easy, fun.
No, that was only a detention center, so it wasn't a full-blown prison, but just to get a basic idea. The guy in the video had a choice to leave at any point, and he didn't. And a couple other things that I thought were important. You could see the quality of food was terrible. You could also see the other inmates around him were struggling, yelling. We're going to talk about mental situations later, and the inmate clearly had a mental breakdown when he came back from court, so I'm guessing he got bad news. That's all normal, everyday interactions in special housing. But, so what is restricted housing? As you can see, it has many different names. Isolation, I call it CHU, because I work at a federal prison, that's what we call it. Administration segregation goes on. They're locked up for 22 to 24 hours a day, which typically, from what I've seen, is 23 to 24. I've never seen an inmate get out for more than an hour at a time. In the prison I work at, it's actually weather-based, so during the winter time, they don't get to go outside because it's snowing, so they close the recreation, so they're locked in for 24 hours a day, sometimes for months at a time, without getting to see light or get fresh air. They're also limited their phones, communications, recreation, visitation. So how phones work, there's 2 phone days a month, and there's about 30 to 60 inmates on a range. The officers do 30-minute rounds. The first cell gets the phone the first round. It works its way down. So if a correctional officer works 8 hours, you may get down 16 cells, so that may cover one range. So a lot of times the inmates don't get their phone calls. And if they're gonna be in restricted housing, chances are they committed some kind of act they weren't allowed to commit. And a lot of times they get their phone privileges taken away. So they don't really get a chance to call home or talk to anybody. And if they do, it's at the most 15 minutes to a half hour, because they're gonna have their phone for 30 minutes to their cell, but usually they have a cellmate. So if they split that time 15 minutes apiece. Communications, they could write letters, but there's many problems with that. They don't have a lot of paper. They get a pencil about 1 inch big. And I don't know if you've ever gone mini golfing, it's usually smaller than that. Another thing too, they don't have access to their property, so they're not gonna know anybody's address, because I'm sure in 2018, not everybody memorizes addresses. And visitation is another important part. When you're in special housing, your visitation's restricted. It's kind of like what you see on TV where you're behind glass. There's non-contact visiting. So you're behind glass, you're handcuffed, and normal visitation for inmates, you get 4 days a week. If you're in special housing, there's 1 day of visiting, and it's usually 4 to 5 hours, is only like an hour or two. And it has to stretch for everybody in special housing, which at some points could be 200 inmates within an hour or two, so your visiting is very limited. Recreation, I've kind of touched on already. Recreation is weather-based, so if it's not safe for an inmate to go outside, they can't go outside. But it works. At 5 a.m., the officer will go around, ask who wants recreation. If their cell is clean and they're following all the rules, they get to go outside. If not, they don't. So if they tear up their bed sheets, don't return their food tray, things like that, they can get their recreation canceled. And when they do get to go outside, they don't get physical touch with each other. They're separated by cages. It kind of looks like dog kennels, if you're familiar with that. All right, so the population, when most people think of a prison, they don't think of this type of setting. You kind of just think of the basic general housing where inmates can watch TV, hang out, play basketball, do whatever they feel like doing, play cards. But the Bureau of Justice Statistics account for 80,000 people in restricted housing. This number is accurate, but it's inaccurate, so that's why I have on the slide who's included and who's not included. The number included is all the federal prisons, because they account for their inmates that are in special housing. Who is not included would be local, state, and private prisons. They don't have to account for their inmates in special housing, so the 80,000 statistic is kind of just a guesstimate. Also not included in that figure is juveniles, because since the Obama administration, you can no longer place juveniles in restricted housing. Alright, so we talked about what it is, but why would you be in restricted housing? There's 3 different reasons: violating a prison rule, for protective custody, or for a holdover during a transfer. Now, the video mentioned different reasons you could be in that lockup unit. I work at a federal prison, so for there it's not a small infraction. You can't just curse out a guard or yell at somebody. It has to be a serious infraction, like killing, fighting, having drugs, making a fire, attempting to escape, introduction of a cell phone. So, more serious violations put you in special housing. Now, for protective custody, you may think to yourself, what's that mean? Like, this sounds terrible. Why would I want to be locked in this cell? But there's actually inmates that request to go to special housing unit for their own protection. Inmates in prison a lot of times like to gamble. So we'll pretend I'm an inmate right now. And Bill, you're also an inmate. So we're playing basketball, and I say, hey, I want to bet you 5 books of stamps, because in prison they use stamps as their currency. Then I'm going to beat you in this basketball game. Well, you beat me, and now I'm in trouble because I only have 1 book of stamps. So I come to you and say, hey, here's your book, but I don't have the other 4. So at that point, at a medium or penitentiary level prison, a lot of times everybody's in a gang. So you may not beat me up or kill me, but you may get someone else in your gang to do it. So I have no idea at any point when I'm going to get assaulted or killed or family threatened. So now I'm going to jump back into a correctional officer role. The inmate comes to me and says, hey, I need to go because I'm about to get killed. So then I would call the shift lieutenant and say, I have an inmate that needs protective custody because he gambled. A couple officers would come down and pick him up, and then at that point you can't just request protective custody, you have to give information. So you're going to be considered a snitch on top of everything. So it's usually not good for the inmate at that point. If you're in protective custody, chances are at some point you're going to have to transfer to a new prison. You're going to have to hope at the new prison there's not somebody there from that gang that knows you snitched at the other prison, or you're probably going to have to go through the process all over again. Now the third reason you don't normally see as much would be a holdover for a transfer. So within the prison system, normally you do in-house transfers. So we have a bus team that would drive inmates around. The air marshals will fly them on a plane if it's a long distance, but say if you have an inmate coming from Miami prison, they're trying to go to a prison in Connecticut, it's a really long drive, so for the safety of the staff and the inmates, they'll stop at a prison, say, hey, I need you to hold over 50 inmates for me overnight. So they'll go into special housing just for the night, and then in the morning they'll get back with the bus, go to their ultimate destination. This next video, it's a guy that he was picked up for a DUI, never went to trial, spent 2 years in solitary confinement. They actually sued the government, was awarded $22 million, and upon an appeal, it got lowered to $15 million. But here's the story, just to get an idea.
Back in 2005, a man by the name of Stephen Slevin was arrested for a DUI. Now, he was supposed to stand trial, but he never did stand trial. In fact, they put him in solitary confinement because other inmates described him as suicidal, and they basically left him there for 2 years.
Jesus.
Now, thankfully, this story, did get a little attention, and the courts did find out about this. And originally, a jury had awarded him $22 million for the neglect, and it was severe neglect, as you can see in that picture.
That's his booking photo, right? We think, and and that's him after basically 22 months.
Well, I think that's a great photo because of how telling it is. Because on the left-hand side, you see a guy that you see anywhere. He's not a normal guy that you see down the street. On the right-hand side, you dehumanize them.
Mm-hmm.
You know, all the hair, and he's lost the weight, and he seems like a prisoner, like you see in a movie. And the kind of prisoner you can do anything to. It's okay. Because he's not Bob down the street. He's not the guy you'd run into at Sizzler. He's just that animal in the corner. And who made him that animal? You did.
Yeah. According to reports, he was left in his cell for months at a time, had untreated dental problems, and toenails that grew so long they curled under his feet.
He took out his own tooth.
Oh.
He was
yeah.
crying out, "I'm in such pain, I need to see a dentist." He took his own tooth out.
Yeah.
The tooth is still out now, like I saw the video of him today or this week when they made the settlement.
We actually have the video of him talking about that. We'll show it to you in just a second, but I want to tell you more about the settlement. So originally a jury had awarded him $22 million. However, Doña Ana County in New Mexico appealed, and they got that number down to $15.5 million, which is still a significant amount of money.
The largest ever civil rights settlement in the country.
Well, I think he richly deserves it. You don't understand, 2 years of solitary confinement, man. It's hard not to go mental, let alone the pain of the dental and all the other things and being treated like an animal. 2 years, you'll lose your mind, man. I wouldn't do that for any price.
He says that, you know, when you're in solitary confinement, they let you go outside for an hour a day, but sometimes, not sometimes, quite often, that wouldn't even happen. He would just be locked in that small cell by himself day after day after day. And this is for a DUI, by the way. They just forgot about it.
By the way, it's for nothing. He was never convicted. There was no trial.
Yeah.
It's so outrageous. Now, but think about this too. Now, they didn't have Bradley Manning grow out the beard and the toenails, etc. But Bradley Manning, before he was even charged, just like this guy, in solitary confinement for 9 months. And beyond this, they would strip him down naked. They would do all sorts of demeaning things to him on purpose, turn on the lights at night so he couldn't sleep, take away his blanket, etc. And for that, he not only did he not get any settlement, he's still on trial and might get a life sentence, possibly. Certainly, even on the things he's admitted to, he can get 20 years. You know what they did? They knocked off about 122 days from his term. Why isn't he getting $15.5 million? Why isn't he free to go?
Yeah, let's
This
see.
guy didn't even see a lawyer.
Yeah.
I mean, nothing happened. I mean, they literally forgot about it. But they do point out that over the last 7 years, they've made significant improvements. Well, you wouldn't need to make significant improvements to improve that. You just need to have some way of checking on people on a daily basis to see whether they're just being court.
Yeah, another thing that makes me mad about this is, again, if he was a powerful guy, he wouldn't sit for 2 hours in solitary confinement. But if you're a regular guy, they just forget about you in solitary confinement for 2 years. Nobody bothers to check, hey, why are we treating this man like an animal, like a savage?
Yeah.
Why are we destroying this guy's life? Why won't we help him when he's screaming in agony over his dental pain? Have you ever had a tooth that's
Yes.
giving you that kind of pain? It's the worst pain. Look, I handle pain really well. Okay, I like getting in fights. Okay, I've gotten punched in the face many times and didn't mind. That dental pain is the worst in the world, okay? And you're gonna let that guy scream in the corner like that? But he's not the animal, you're the animal. So $15.5 million at least, if you ask me.
So he did speak to CNN after he got the $15.5 million ruling, and let's take a look at what he had to say.
Walking by me every day, watching me deteriorate, day after day after day. I did nothing at all to get me any help. I wanted people to know that the people in the Doña Ana County Jail that are doing things like this to people and getting away with it.
So it reminds me, of course, of the Zimbardo experiment at Stanford. And what they did was they took Stanford students, if you don't know about this, one of the greatest experiments of all time, but they had to end it because it immediately went so badly in terms of what wound up happening. Stanford students, really well educated, made half of them prisoners, half of them guards. And immediately the prisoners became, were humiliated and embarrassed, and the guards became savages in terms of how they treated the others, and it got so out of hand, Professor Zimbardo had to end the experiment early. And this is what it does, and we have to be aware of it, right? It happens in even the best circumstances, the most educated kids who meant to do well, etc. they would degrade and humiliate their classmates, even though it was in the middle of an experiment. They immediately got into the roles. And that's what happens. It makes savages not out of the people who are in prison, but out of the imprisoners. Martin Luther King was talking about in the Civil Rights era, we are here to set not just us free, but we're here to set our oppressors free. Because it makes them inhumane, it makes them unhuman. And we want to get them back to humanity and morality. And our job is to set everyone free. And so we've got to be incredibly careful about how we imprison people. Because the natural tendency of the prisoner is to become an animal and to treat other human beings savagely like this. And unfortunately, in this case, we certainly didn't do that, and I'm glad they got punished for it, and we need to set an example here so they never do it again.
All right, now, and that was an example of a local prison where that occurred. I've never had an experience at local prison, but
My team and I always had trouble managing our time.
where I work, health services or a medical team will go through at least 3 times a day, talk to all the inmates. If they have any concerns, like such as the guy's tooth, that would be addressed, not instantly, but within a reasonable amount of time. Also, for at a federal prison, you're not going to see something like that where a guy just gets put away for 2 years. They have to go in front of what's called a DHO, disciplinary hearing officer. They sanction them to go to the special housing. You can't just throw somebody in special housing because you feel like you're having a bad day. Or in his case, they said he was suicidal. At where I work, there's suicide watch, where a staff member or another inmate will watch it, make sure they don't hang themselves or injure themselves. So this is a situation unique that I'm not familiar with, but as the statistics show, there's a lot of unaccounted for inmates that are in this type of housing. So this could be happening more than we know. So we saw that guy's effects on his body. When he went in, he didn't look nearly as bad as when he got out of prison. At one point, he looked like for better lack of words, a homeless guy, which I guess he kind of was. But there's many different physical and mental effects that affect inmates whenever they're locked into restricted housing. I have a list here I'm going to look at. Visual and auditory hallucinations. So, like what was mentioned on there, the inmates can't control their lights, the officers do. So, not saying that it happens often, but somebody forgets to turn off a light, or the inmate wants the light to be left on, they don't get any darkness, so that's going to interrupt their sleep, which can lead to insomnia. There's a hypersensitivity to noise and touch. As we saw in the video, the first video, where the reporter was locked in prison, there's a bunch of screaming going on, there's constant chaos. And the inmates don't get touched unless, if they have a cellmate, they can touch each other, but they don't allowed to have a sexual relationship. And uncontrollable feelings of rage and fear. We also saw that in the first video when the inmate came back from his court. He obviously had some bad news there. Increased risk of suicide. Statistically, the most common inmate to hang himself would be in restricted housing in a single cell without a cellmate. There's no one there to talk him out of it, there's no one to let anybody know. So in the federal prisons, we have to do regular rounds every 30 to 40 minutes. But still within 30 minutes, someone's gonna be dead if they're hanging. So it happens more often than not in special housing. PTSD also occurs for inmates in this special housing because their life's just traumatic at that point. They're not treated like human beings. And a lot of times, they go from the restricted housing to the streets. So they go from all this traumatic experience straight to the streets, and mentally they're just not themselves. So it causes them to reoffend. Statistically, if you're in special housing at your release, you have I believe it's a 4 times higher effect where you're going to commit crime again as soon as you get out. Wind up back in prison, which defeats the whole purpose of going to prison for rehabilitation. So, is restricted housing torture? I'm going to read you the definition of the United Nations definition of torture. So the UN Convention Against Torture defines torture as any state-sanctioned act by which severe pain or suffering, whether physical or mental, is intentionally inflicted on a person for informational, punishment, intimidation, or for a reason based on discrimination. So strictly by that definition, restricted housing is torture, because you are inflicting punishment, intimidation, and mental and physical pain on an inmate when you're putting them in this housing, especially for long periods of time. Now, why would it not be torture? We talked about protective custody. That can't be considered torture because they're voluntarily subjecting themselves to this treatment. And they can leave at any point. They could say they don't no longer need protective custody, they go back into the general population. And if they get injured, they get injured. I mean, it's ultimately on them. Okay. Now, is it the end of restricted housing? The previous administration, the Obama administration, made many changes in restricted housing over the past 5 years. The current administration hasn't really made any changes to it other than privatizing prisons, which I'm not familiar with their rules, but typically the private prisons house federal inmates, have to follow the same regulations, 30-minute round, suicide watch. But the Obama administration made a significant change. Prior to their administration, juveniles were able to be placed in this type of housing. And for juveniles, the mental health issue is a big significant difference than on an adult. So for an adult, it has an effect, PTSD, the mental anguish. For a juvenile, they're still developing, so it does permanent damage to them. For the adult offender, you can recover from it. From the juvenile, that's typically permanent damage done to their mental being. And prisoners and their families have taken the lead in making the public and policy aware of the cruelty taking place in correctional facilities. So, a lot of times inmates are right home talking about how terrible their settings are, and their families go and protest. Now, I'm not sure, the second video, I'm not sure if that guy talked to anybody or not, but they did mention he didn't even get legal counsel over the 2 years. So it sounds like in some of the restricted housing, you don't have access to mail or any contact, or kind of just stuck there until they decide to let you out. But as far as legal advice and attorney visits when you're in a federal special housing, it's regulated. You can receive legal visits. You get legal mail. You get regular mail, but you can still write home, talk about the terrible settings. And me personally, I've never seen an investigation in CHU based off of an inmate complaining about the habitat. It could be different in different prisons, because it sounds like inmates can be treated inhumanely. But does anybody have any questions? All right, well, thanks for taking your time and coming in today.